Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for coming here to cover some of the alternative viewpoints here at the State House. I remain grateful for that. You've probably heard me say this ad nauseum, but it merits repeating. The minority has three fundamental jobs. The first is to help the majority when it's for the good of the state. The second is to critique their policies so they get better or become less terrible than they otherwise would have been. And the third one is to provide alternatives. We don't get to rule the state. We can't impose our will on the majority, but I am very gratified and appreciative that my caucus did an outstanding job in the tasks that were assigned to it by Providence. And let's talk about the helping. And this, I think, is very important. One of the key bills of this session is the gaming bill. It was turned into a mess in the Ways and Means Committee, and it's my caucus that helped fix it. We moved a common sense piece of legislation that solves our gaming competitiveness issues holistically. We moved it over to the Senate, where I'm not sure exactly what the fate will be, but the fact is that we got it back on track. And that's a good example of what parties can do working together on what are really fundamentally nonpartisan issues. Secondly, on the critiquing part, some of these onerous education bills that nobody seems to understand were derailed. We saw a significant one voted down on the floor the other day, a coalition between my caucus and pragmatic Republicans. That's a good thing. We haven't stopped everything bad with respect to education, but it's good that when the right arguments are waged, they will even appeal to some of the most red-ribbed, I'm looking for the right metaphor regarding ribs, but some of your hardcore conservatives will join forces with us in a pragmatic way to make sure that our classrooms are protected from being laboratories for whatever ideological experiments are going on. But the third thing that I'm proudest of is that we provided some real alternatives. We didn't get our way, but the public can see the differences in approach. We have reminded the House majority and the Senate majority and the governor that just because they might have 71% of the seats doesn't mean that 71% of the people agree with them. And we offered some very mainstream alternatives regarding the direction of Indiana. Perfect example is with respect to wages and salaries. Over and over again, we've preached that the key to future economic prosperity is wage and salary growth here in Indiana. We've done plenty to invest in investors. It's now time to look at the other side of the equation. We need consumers, we need workers who are empowered, we need people with more economic independence within their households, and we need to move up those median household incomes that are really lagging behind our brother and sister states. We had 4 different votes on increasing modestly the minimum wage here in Indiana. And the purpose isn't to solve every economic problem for every family, but it does move wage growth in the right direction. That was voted down 4 times. And at the same time, we saw the biggest wage deflation bill move forward with respect to the repeal of the common construction wage, which has been here in Indiana for decades, and which has served our state well, which has kept an upward pressure on wages in all sectors, keeps Indiana jobs in Indiana, and by the way, also supports very reputable Indiana businesses who help build our state and move it into the future and maintain it. And that's been being moved forward, unfortunately, but it has given the people of Indiana opportunity to see the differences in approach, be able to make judgments going forward. We had some very key differences in approach with respect to education, which remains at the top of everyone's minds. We offered a middle-class tax cut for once with respect to repealing the textbook tax. That would get money in the pockets of middle-class consumers, not just the people at the lowest rungs who always need some pressures taken off of them, but folks in the middle. That would have included not only public school parents, but parochial school parents who also fork over money for textbooks every year. Would have gotten money in people's pockets. With the same amount of money that the Republicans proposed to spend on education, we offered a different way to distribute it. We found ways that we could have funded pre-K initiatives and full-day kindergarten. We made our school funding, offered a way to make it more honest and more transparent by putting our 3 different school systems under 3 different pots of money. We funded vouchers in charter schools and traditional K through 12 schools separately, something that the people think is common sense and which they demand. We made sure that every school system, every community had a breather from continued cuts. We found a way to at least get them to adapt to recent changes so they could catch up. We looked for ways to make college costs more affordable and predictable. We froze tuition rates for those who started a degree program and found a reasonable way to fund those tuition rates so they weren't hammering our reputable and proud institutions of higher education. And I want to reemphasize the point that we did this all in a way where the public could understand the changes that were being made. We did away with the sleights of hand and the parlor tricks that exist with respect to education funding, where we're talking about doing increases, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of our kids and our schools and our communities keep falling further and further behind. We provided alternatives to keep Indiana from being 50th in voter turnout. They were looking for ways that were going to make it harder for people to vote and pass them. We offered alternatives that would make it easier for people to vote and encourage participation in our electoral process. And then finally, I would say that there's some very clear ways that we've provided alternatives with respect to leaving people alone and also providing some common sense mainstream solutions to practical problems. A perfect example, and it didn't shake the world, but it was an illustration. Common sense proposal to make it easier and encourage people to get vaccines for HPV. Make sure our kids get vaccinated. Something that's supported by science. We didn't make anybody do anything, but we encouraged folks to get these types of vaccinations to save them from cancer years down the road. Now, maybe the majority didn't like it, and you know what, if the majority doesn't like something, there's quiet ways that they could make something go away and change the discussion, but that wasn't enough. They had to beat up on that idea on the floor of the House of Representatives and make sure that everyone could see they were voting it down. That exemplifies the problem that we're seeing around here. It stopped being about common sense and pragmatic solutions to practical everyday problems. Instead, what we're seeing is old-fashioned thinking about real-life modern issues. We're seeing power grabs for power's sake. And finally, we're seeing it indulging in ideological agenda that gives some psychological gratification to those that are talking about it, but really don't fix anything that people are interested in fixing. We've offered mainstream and centrist solutions that I know that most people in Indiana support. And I'm not happy about the outcome, but I am happy about the differences that have been drawn. And I think that's a good thing for Indiana. And I'm grateful that you're here to report on the role that we do. And I hope it will give some perspective when you get to walk down to the second floor and hear something different in a few minutes. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
On things like the vaccine bill, a little bit on the gaming bill, are we starting to see Governor Pence exert some influence in the legislative process?
Yes, and I don't know if it's been helpful or not. I don't think it's been helpful to his own party. That gaming bill was a mess. We started with something that was, again, common sense, mainstream, studied, and supported by a lot of people. And again, given some of his own personal objections to gaming, or maybe going and talking to some crowds that have some old-fashioned thoughts about it, he got involved in a way that he doesn't ordinarily get involved, and it turned it into a fiasco. I'm glad we're able to right the ship. But you know what? If he needs to decide if he's going to be involved or not be involved. And if he is going to be involved, he ought to be getting involved in order to help and not just to keep something from reaching his desk that he has some personal objections to or that don't fulfill his ideas about what the universe ought to look like.
Scott, on the issue of school funding, Speaker said earlier this week that, yes, it is the changes will be painful for some school districts, but in a nutshell, it's just time to rip off the Band-Aid, because you've had school districts that have been losing population, for years. The funding is always, the new model thinking is the funding should follow the child. How do you reconcile that? I mean, should a school district that's losing population, get more dollars?
As usual, excellent question, Abdul. They already ripped off the Band-Aid about 5 years ago, and it's still bleeding profusely, the wound. You know what? That debate's going to continue. That funding communities versus funding the child, actually, that can be reconciled, and we've reconciled in the past. Both things are important. Both things are important. The money needs to often go to where there's more kids, but at the same time, you have the kids left over in communities, and they still have the same fixed costs. The heaters still run at some of these places. So we have to do both things at the same time. And there's a way to keep having that discussion. And by the way, that's an example of how governing is hard. It's not easy. You've got to reconcile those two things, and that's okay. But what we've said is we've only been doing it the one way. We've tried to strap ATMs to the back of every kid and think that that's the best way to fund schools, when in reality we've got school systems that are part of the fabric of the cities and towns here in Indiana, and we've got to remember that too. So what we've said is, look, just give everyone a breather. Okay, we know that where most of the money continues to go, that's not really going to change radically, but you can make it a little easier on the bottom end and allow them to catch up so they can continue to phase out some of their fixed costs. I think that's common sense, and I think that's supported by most people, and I think that's supported by people even in growing school corporations, because they do think about the rest of the state, and they do realize that we're all in this thing together. So, again, there's a balance there, and that's what we're talking about. It's balance. It's not doing it all one way or all the other way.
Representative, you have two bills concerning I-STEP alternatives coming your way from the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Both kind of propose looking at a national test rather than Indiana creating its own I-STEP.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, listen, it's somebody I have a lot of admiration for over there is Senator Kenley. He is a smart man, and he is my example of what a pragmatic conservative ought to be. And that's an idea that deserves some serious consideration. Because what do we care about here? Everyone agrees that there needs to be some accountability. We got to know how our kids are doing. We got to know how our schools are doing. We need a common sense way to judge those things. That's okay. But we don't want kids sitting through tests all day long. We don't want to overcomplicate it, and we don't want it to be so costly that we don't have enough money left over to get kids the help that they need when they're falling behind, because that matters too. So I think that those are the types of common sense things we ought to be talking about. We shouldn't just be doubling down on experiments. Give our educational system a breather. Let them not have to, test. Ratchet that down a little bit and look for ways to give kids that are falling behind a little bit more help. If we do those things, I think people are going to be, I think they're going to think we're heading in a satisfactory direction, and they think that they're still going to believe that there's some reasonable changes that are being made. We've got to stop with the wholesale changes. That's not the problem, because everyone's flummoxed down at the school level. They don't understand what it is that's being done here in this building, and we've got to back off from that. And anything that backs that off a little bit, I think, is on balance good.
Would you then support those bills?
Well, I want to take a look at them. We've been up to our ears in the House bills up to this point, and I haven't gotten a chance to look at every Senate bill, but I'm generally familiar with it. And let's, making testing simpler and less expensive and less long, those are generally positive goals, and I think they merit some degree of pursuit.
Senate Bill 1 is the one that changes a bunch of stuff on the state board. Leaving aside the part about replacing Ritz as board chair, do you like the idea of the legislature having some appointing power on the state board? Well,
I said this before. If they want to give me an appointment, I haven't asked for it, but I'll exercise it, if they give it to me. But I think we need to rethink that altogether. I mean, we offered some alternatives. Maybe they should be, maybe they should be chosen by the voters, the folks on that state board. I see Matt Pearson here. He had an idea. Maybe they should be selected by locally elected school boards. Those are the ideas that we should be looking at. And you know what? One thing that might make it a little easier too, let's not be making so many decisions here in Indianapolis. We've disempowered locally elected school boards in a lot of significant ways. That's really where we ought to be shifting responsibility. They used to make a lot of decisions. You know what? People in urban areas, people in rural areas who love their schools liked it that way. And we've gone completely the other direction. I mean, we just saw it, yesterday. Representative Baining was wanting to put more and more decision-making authority in these bureaucrats. I think that's a bigger problem as opposed to who's putting them on there. The decisions need to be made more and more out there at the community level and less here in this building. And if we're doing that, then I think we're truly headed in the right direction. Otherwise, we're just dickering around about the existing structure. And maybe something's marginally better than another, but I have stronger feelings about local control than I do about the structure of this board.
You have any thoughts
How
on
do you explain the widespread support for a soccer stadium that doesn't even have a location?
Well, I don't know if the support is widespread, and I don't think it's very deep. And when I say it's not deep, I mean it's really not very deep. I think that I think it is something that people are not quite ready to shut down the conversation on yet. But it's got it by the end of session. It's going to have to pass the giggle test, or I think it's not going to pass the voting test. It's something worth keeping alive. I thought it was worth keeping alive. Anytime you have the prospect for a very big project that could help Indiana and put people to work. And by the way, something that puts people to work can have a ripple effect too, because that it draws labor there and it creates other labor opportunities for people elsewhere. But it's going to have to make sense. I don't think it's quite there all the way yet, but I think there's a lot of folks that voted for it, did so without a huge degree of enthusiasm. And part of it is just because they don't really like soccer that much. But they're interested in the economic development possibilities. I think what that vote was is just saying, let's keep talking about it. Let's see if there's a common sense way to do it that isn't a burden on taxpayers, but maybe grants a little bit of flexibility here locally. If we can do that, then maybe it's something we can do. But if we can, I think people will be content to come back and talk about it another time too.
Any thoughts on the controversy out of Newcastle that's garnered some national attention about the kids who wrote the letters to the governor, saying to leave the superintendent of public instruction alone, but they seem to be letters that are maybe well beyond the traditional scope of maybe 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders?
Yeah, I did see it. I don't know if I have real strong thoughts about it. I follow Twitter as you do, Abdul, and I did happen to read that story. I think didn't Swearens write something about that yesterday? I don't know. I guess I'd have to learn more about it. But I'm going to say this: my 6th grade teacher, and there's a picture of him right over here, was State Senator Dennis Neary, who used to be the Senate Minority Leader once upon a time. And guess what? He had views on things. And I learned a lot. I don't think there's anything wrong with teachers having views, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with students learning about them. You learn from adults. And guess what? You grow up and you don't necessarily have the same views that your teacher had, but sometimes they do shape how you think about things. So I don't know what this individual teacher was doing or whether it was a big deal. But you know what? Kids can sustain all sorts of, they can persevere through all sorts of things that adults say. So they're more resilient than we give them credit for.
I suspect I know what you think of the religious freedom bill coming over from the Senate. Is there a way to word that would be acceptable, or is this something that just does not belong?
Well, thanks for bringing that up. Can't these so-called conservatives just leave people alone? My goodness. Is it that hard for people to follow the golden rule and be nice to each other without the legislature thinking it needs to intervene every time? this is I'm saying I'm going to claim the conservative mantle right now, okay, and I don't cede it to the other side. And this is conservative with a small c. That's not conservative. The stuff they do, that is social engineering, and just let people be. It's not that difficult, and that bill needs to go away.
You know, this week we saw several bills, or, you know, a handful get pulled, you know, without a final vote on the floor. You know, why do you think there's a hesitancy not to take a final vote on things like Sunday sales, you know, or even annexation? I mean, why not just do an up and down vote and see where it goes?
Well, I'll give you the lawmaker's answer. It's ego. A lot of times, nobody likes to see their bill beat. You know, these folks, they put their names on something, and they don't want to endure the personal repudiation of more red lights than green lights. And you know what? I would say that those are living, breathing human beings out there. Now I'm going to give you also a legal answer too. If something has more than 51 votes against it, it's what we call decisively defeated. Means you can't even talk about it anymore, or aren't supposed to. And sometimes there's that consideration, but it's mostly the first one. But I would say to my colleagues, there's no shame in having a bill beat down. Sometimes, how often do I offer things, and guess what? They almost always get defeated as the minority leader, and that's okay. I live to tell about it, and it doesn't get me down, so they can go through it too.
Do you think Sunday sales going to pass in its original form?
You mean as it came out of committee?
Well, as it was introduced, where you allow for Sunday sales, but also the restrictions on the liquor store.
You know, Abdul, that's another good question, because I've parsed through those vote counts. I don't know. I don't know. There's some people that don't want any Sunday sales at all. There's some
31.
There's some people that want the whole kit and caboodle. For everybody to do whatever they want to do. And then there's kind of a group that's in between, and those allegiances sort of shift. So I don't know what the solution is. I think what you saw is why a lot of chairmen in the past have kept the thing bottled up in committee, because that's the dynamic that you see. And you got to remember, it's really largely about market share, and some of that market share, whether it shifts to to whom it shifts. I don't know if that's the right grounds to consider it, but that's a factor that goes in there, because you do have alcohol retailers that are regulated differently, and that impacts some of the policy decisions. And then you heard Representative Smith, who has an objection to any Sunday sales. So I think it would have been interesting to see the final vote. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that it didn't happen, but certainly there's something to be learned. I think my colleague to the south, Representative Dermody, did the best that he could in shepherding that bill through. But it's been a tough issue for a long time. I don't know why it's that tough, but it is, Abdul. And but I'll say this: I know it's not going away. One thing that has definitely changed is there is now a willingness to talk about it in ways that haven't happened before. So I think we're going to be stuck dealing with in more substantive ways beyond just, oh, that's neat, you filed a bill, it's going to sit over here in this neat little pile.
Have you had a chance to look at the balanced budget amendment, and are you satisfied with the way that's worded?
No, I haven't had a chance to look at it, but whatever it says, again, that's a solution in search of a problem. We balance our budgets here in Indiana. We already have language in our Constitution. If you look at a map of the United States that comes from interstate observers, they typically list Indiana as one that has a balanced budget requirement. That is purely an Iowa talking point in Governor Pence's just in case file that he keeps in his desk drawer.
In terms of the school funding formula, how has that affected IPS in terms of cuts and stuff?
Okay, well that's another thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but I'm delighted that it arose from the ranks of our Fourth Estate. Their numbers were that wrong. By the way, their school funding formula didn't fix the problem. They said they were going to fix the school funding formula. They didn't do it. And now it's coming out that the data that was used to make the school distribution formula was wrong. I don't understand every reason it was wrong, but whatever they thought they were voting for wasn't the numbers. I mean, I've already seen some. Actually, the cuts for Indianapolis were worse than what was reported. The cuts for Fort Wayne were worse than what was reported. Talking about a lot of kids there. I understand, now on the flip side, I understand, like up in Northwest Indiana, I think Gary came out a little bit better than they otherwise had. Not good, but a little better. And I only use that for illustration purposes. The point is, probably all the numbers were off. So Senator Kenley's probably going to have to start fresh. But again, whatever they voted for over here wasn't what they thought they were voting for.
When you say the numbers are off, so did you see a second LSA run or?
Not yet, but I've gotten individual reports on individual communities. And, the original numbers weren't right. Now, by the way, again, human beings, I understand mistakes happen. But that's a pitfall of the budget process. This stuff is very difficult, and that's why transparency and simplicity matter more and more, because we've made it complicated on ourselves. We've got to unravel these things. And again, something that would definitely unravel it is the separate pots of money for the 3 different school systems. And I'm going to tell you what, I go talk to, I will say this, groups of voters who aren't instinctively going to stand up and cheer when I'm talking. And when I talk about the 3 pots of money, their heads nod up and down. They think that makes sense. That's something that's something that takes the edge off a few of the inevitable mistakes when they do happen. Because, bureaucrats and bean counters make mistakes.
Isn't separating out the 3 pots of money in school funding really just an attempt to make it easier for you to argue that vouchers should be cut?
No, honestly, we're not making that argument. We do believe that we ought to limit the growth so we can take stock of whether we're being successful in what we've decided to do or not. I'm past the policy argument. Okay, we've had the policy arguments for a number of years, and they'll arise periodically, but in the context of where are we steering our dollars now? You have to separate those things out. So 1, you can ascertain what the growth is. 2, you can control the growth. And 3, you can better understand what's working and what isn't and adjust the funding accordingly. If you're just letting it slosh around in one big mosh pit, you're not ever going to know what's helping and what's not. And that has to be deconstructed.
Are vouchers and charter funding really that detrimental to traditional K through 12 education? Because if you look at the state budget, we spend about $6.5–6 billion. I thought the last number I saw for vouchers and charter was about maybe like 120 million, total and some change.
Well, okay, but I will say this: when you have schools with fixed costs that they have to keep up with, those things around the margins do make a lot of difference. That makes the difference between layoffs and bigger classroom sizes and not, and cutting important educational programs and not. So that's why when we talk about 1–2%, that's real stuff. That's real stuff to real people. So it does make a difference, and it also but remember, it doesn't make the same difference everywhere. It makes a difference in places like where I live, and I'm not talking just for me, but I use that as an example. It also makes a difference in your rural schools, in particular, because what we see there is they come out with the cuts, but they don't have the choices. At least where I live, if that's the direction you want to go, if you have the cut, well, there's the choice there still. They don't even have the choice. They just get the downside. So that needs to be fixed. And again, Abdul, this is not an ideological thing. This is an empirical thing. It's getting those figures right. We're just not doing it. We're not doing it. We keep doubling down on the direction it's been going. All I've been saying, again, ratchet it back a little bit. People appreciate it.
I want to ask one thing about the common construction wage debate. We keep hearing this example in Allen County of one wage that was more than double a wage set the same day in the same part of the state. Isn't that a problem, that the common wage in one place would be so different depending on the project?
Well, but that's why we've always said local wage setting. The common wages are different. And they are different based on sector and geography and community. All those things come into it. And not everybody gets their way all the time. But it's worked for many, many years because you save taxpayer money, because the job gets done right by people with qualifications, and it upholds the principle that you get what you pay for. You pay for better work to be done, and better work gets done. You don't have cost overruns and buildings falling down and those sorts of things. And 3, it keeps Indiana jobs in Indiana because you don't have the rock bottom lowest bidder dragging in real cheap workers from elsewhere. That's sticking up for ourselves. And again, when I talk about leaving people alone, that's a perfect example. Nobody's out there begging for this to be passed except a few special interests. My goodness, just leave these workers alone. Leave these businesses alone. Those were businesses came in to testify. Good businesses, good employers, ones that we purport to want to help. They need to just back off of that thing. I hope the Senate is more sensible about this. Sometimes, believe it or not, I tend to trust them a little more. Sometimes I trust them less. But in this case, I hope that cooler heads prevail and they realize that this is as much about the people writing paychecks as it is about those who are receiving them for the hard work that they did. Anybody else?
I have one more about testing.
Yes.
So those 2 bills I mentioned, one of them is structured so that it would ask for a national test next year, right?
Right.
The other has been amended to form a summer study committee on such. If you had to choose, would you rather see something like that happen sooner or go to a study committee?
Can you give me a chance to study it first, and then I'll study whether we need the study committee? Thanks, everybody.